So if the tools that you're using have the settings, you can apply something that's kind of like a snap distance or fuzzy tolerance would be more appropriate in this case. You can apply a tolerance that could be distance-based or area-based if the tool has the function built into it, where your outputs will ignore slivers that are too small for you to worry about. So you set, for example, if it was something where you may have a horizontal distance of, that things that are 5 meters long you're not interested in. So if the tool has the setting, you tell it to ignore everything less than 10 meters in size. If you think about area, you may decide that the minimum that you're going to be interested in studying is going to be an acre, for example. So you can tell the tool, again, if it has the functionality built into it, you say, in the resulting data set, we're going to ignore everything that's less than 1 acre, and you're just going to force it to be absorbed into the nearest other polygon. Okay. So that's something that's available in some GIS systems, in some GIS tools. Just look for it in the graphic user interface in ArcGIS. When you're doing geoprocessing, if it's there, you may be able to set that property and then eliminate some of these small slivers during your geoprocessing steps so that your output is cleaner. As Price points out, they can be tricky to set. They're not good if they're too small, and if you make them too big, you're going to lose a lot of information potentially. So it's something to experiment with if you do have access to it. And like with the other tools, it's only going to affect your output data set. It's not going to affect the input data sets. It's not like applying a filter to the input and then rewriting the input information. It only applies to the output. So let's get back to this idea. This is an important idea of maintaining the characteristics of area and length within your vector data sets, because that, as you go about doing your geoprocessing, you're necessarily going to be changing and altering the input data sets as they get output, and your final analysis may depend upon having as accurate and precise as possible, as truthful as possible, lengths and areas of these vector data sets in order to do the best analysis that you can. Okay, so remember that when you use geodatabases, the area and length categories or variables in those vector data sets are going to be automatically updated for you. So you may consider that to be a really good advantage of using geodatabases over using the older approach of shapefiles to house your vector data sets. So we've used this slide before. We're going to redux it here. We're going to reuse it and hit home on this idea that geoprocessing and geoprocessing sequences can change lengths and areas of your featured data sets. So a good thing to bear in mind, geodatabases have a lot of good features, characteristics, and one of them is that the shape, length, and area fields for each of those vector data sets when you're doing geoprocessing will be automatically updated. Other ones that you may have in your data set will not be updated automatically, but the length and area fields that get used the most often are. If you're doing work in vector data models using individual shapefiles, those have to be updated manually. And so how do you do that? How do you manually update a shapefile after you've done something to it? Whenever you do some sort of a process that's going to alter its geometry, you need to manually get into the table, right-click on the column for area, the column for length, and then calculate geometry, and it will update that information in that data set. If you're using shapefiles and you modify the shapefiles, this is something that you need to do in order to have a good control over your data and the information that it contains about the Earth's surface. So we're maintaining logical consistency. So if you think about all the times you're going to need to do this with shapefiles, you might decide, geodatabases, they look pretty good. So a few more things that we can do geoprocessing wise are these four different functions: dissolve, buffer, append, and merge. And you should have created buffers at least before this point in time, perhaps a dissolve in the exercises. But let's go through and see what they can do. So dissolving is you're simplifying the geometry of line or polygon features. In the case above, we have a street network, and we're going to dissolve the street network based upon street name. So if we do that, it gets rid of all of the intersections, all the nodes along the different road names. So Main Street here, with all those different node locations, the different line segments, but they're all Main Street, become a single line with one start node and one end node instead of having all the vertices in between. So literally dissolving the feature. It's still there, but we're simplifying it by getting rid of all the multiple entries at those different intersections. Below, if we look at dissolving polygons, in this case polygons that are describing habitat class. So we have all these different letters denoting different types of habitat. But we see that there's a number of them that are the same habitat class, but they are adjacent to each other and they share boundaries. So what dissolve does is it just gets rid of those boundaries, and we wind up not necessarily simplifying it so much as we are acknowledging that yes, these are the same class in these different polygon areas, and we want to treat them as a single polygon entity. So we just dissolve the boundaries in between, and we wind up with the same amount of area in each habitat class, but a smaller number of polygons describing each of those habitat classes across space. So dissolve is a pretty powerful thing to use, and sometimes you need to do that for various reasons to simplify the geometry in a way that you can use that resulting data set for another purpose. So dissolving eliminates all the attributes in the table except for the dissolved one, but you can choose in the output data set to summarize the other attributes with some basic statistics. And the tool will ask you that as you invoke the dissolve tool. It'll ask you if you want to do that, and you can select the information that you want summarized statistically based upon the columns of information that are in the table. So dissolve is something that can be pretty handy to use if you think about it in the use of geoprocessing lots of different types of information. Price says that overlay is time and memory intensive. That's not as much of a problem these days with modern computers, but still it may be very useful to minimize the number of features in a data set to assist in simplifying information down your geoprocessing chain of events. So for example, let's pretend that this graphic here is showing us vegetation land parcels or vegetation units across space for a study area. Each color is a different vegetation type, a different dominant vegetation type in that particular area. And let's say the green is conifer trees. Now, for our analysis, if we only need to know that those are conifer tree dominated parcels, do we really need to have all the detail that we have now with the individual little pieces of land? And if not, then let's dissolve it. And then if we do further geoprocessing with other polygons, we're reducing the number of features that we're going to get in the end. So we're going to simplify the data in a way by removing the borders. We still retain the information that it's conifer trees in that area. It's still going to be the same number, the same acreage of conifers. That's not going to change. But what's going to change is how many polygons there are of conifer. And so if we wanted to combine this with geological units, for example, from before, or a slope class from before, we're going to wind up with fewer numbers of individual features in that end data set that combines all of those things. So dissolving, again, very powerful, very useful, and you need to think about how to use it in your process to simplify your work, so you're not eliminating detail that's necessary, but you're eliminating some details that maybe you don't need, that aren't critical down the road. So if we only need to know that, yes, all of that area that's shown in green is conifer, and we don't need to know the individual little pieces of conifer, then we can just dissolve that out, and we've got a simpler representation of the same information, but without all that complex geometry. And we have a simpler geometry that still has the data that we need. Anyway, so that hopefully that makes sense. Buffering is something you should have done before now, but essentially we can buffer points, lines, and polygons. You set a distance, and it's going to create polygons around whatever you specify. So for point locations, it's going to create, by default, circles around it. And in an example here, we have two different polygon buffers created around points. On the right is a single buffer around a linear network, probably a stream network. Okay, and so you specify the distance, you specify the shape, whether it's going to be circular with rounded ends, or if it's going to be a rectangle around those, or a square around those things. Normally, we would use rounded features around most buffers. But that's what it does. And the output is a polygon, a new polygon data set that is the area of the buffer that you've decided to create. Appending is something that you may or may not use very much. It's something you should really be aware of the details before you do it. So here I'm recommending read help, the ArcGIS help entries on the append function before you do it. Visibly, what we see here is two input data sets and an output. So appending looks like a union, but it's not. It doesn't join those things together. They don't give the same output that a union would, or even an intersect. Okay, they are simply visually putting those things together in the output. So in this case, let's say this is a stream network. You have an existing data set in blue. You're appending the green data set. Your output looks like a stream network, but those lines actually aren't connected in a network. They will not function like a network. They're just visibly being displayed that way. So it has some limitations. You know, it might be useful if you need to only display the information and make it look like it's all connected. But if you really need to have the connectivity, the topology of those things, as if it was a complete stream network, you're going to need to use something else besides append. So the last of the geoprocessing tools and functions we'll look at briefly is merge. merging. I'm just going to read off the slide here. Combines two feature classes of the same type into a new combined feature class. It does not attempt to split or change the features. It allows overlaps, and the attribute tables of the two inputs can be different. It's kind of a weird tool. It's one that I would strongly recommend that you really not use. It doesn't seem to serve a whole lot of functions down the processing chain. A union would probably be a better approach for analysis. So what I would say with this tool is if you decide to use it, you read the help, ArcGIS help, twice before using it, and make sure that you understand what it is and what it's doing. It's something that I don't use very often in the work that I've done in GIS. The append tool is also one that I don't use very often. They just don't seem to me, to be very useful. Append and merge are kind of visually putting things together, but they don't really serve a whole lot of analytical purposes. I'm not getting a data set out of these that's something that I can really use for later analysis, at least not very efficiently. So that's why I tend not to use them, but I think we need to mention them because they are a couple of the major tools that are available to you in geoprocessing. All right, so there's that.